What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
They always said it was an oversight, a busy week, a tight month, a flu that conveniently struck the day before, a travel delay that stranded them on the far side of town, a thousand soft excuses that dissolved like cheap paper napkins in the sink. And I nodded like a good sport because I learned early that nodding was faster than asking why my birthday kept slipping behind grocery lists and yard work and my brother's practice schedule, while his big day arrived every single year with a marching band of attention, a chorus of cousins, a galaxy of balloons taped to the ceiling, and a cake so tall you had to tilt your head back to read the frosting. And if you think I am exaggerating, then you've never watched a family perform devotion like a televised pageant where the crown is always pre-assigned. When I turned 16, which should feel like a small coronation even in a modest household, Mom slid a cardboard box of leftover pizza onto the counter and kissed the air near my temple while telling me the oven was already warm if I wanted to crisp the slices, and Dad called from the driveway that he'd fill the tank in my car as a treat, which would have been generous if I had a car, which I did not, while Ethan's 18th happened 7 months later in a rented hall with a photo booth and a clap-happy DJ who pronounced our last name wrong all night, and nobody cared because the point was volume, not accuracy, and Mom wept during the speeches like she had raised a senator, and Dad slapped backs like he had personally invented his only son. And I stood at the dessert table stacking plates, because motion is the best disguise for being unnecessary. You learn to narrate yourself in a tone that doesn't echo, so I told myself I was fine. I told myself I preferred quiet evenings to loud rooms. I told myself the pizza was actually better the next day. I told myself that calendars were suggestions and not promises, and I told myself that being forgettable is a kind of freedom because no one monitors your choices when they keep missing your dates. Then, in the same breath, I saved the paper invitation from Ethan's party and slid it into a folder, with my report cards and a scholarship letter that nobody bothered to frame, because private archives are the only museums some people ever get. There was a summer at the lake that should have been equalizing, because water doesn't care whose name is on the cake, yet even there the hierarchy arrived with sunscreen. And we rented a narrow clapboard cabin while the next property overgleamed with fresh paint and a private dock that lifted from the water like a promise. And Dad pointed at that dock and joked that when Ethan hit it big he'd buy one just like it. And Mom laughed and pinched his arm and looked at me as if to balance the conversation with something gentle, then asked me to run back inside and fetch more ice, and I did, because errands are a family's way of smoothing the surface. Still, I stood on the public pier later that evening and watched the neighbors' lights turn gold in the windows and thought how funny it is that we act like ownership is a personality trait that belongs to certain children more than others. If this all sounds like bitterness, it wasn't, not then, not in the simple heat of those years. It was inventory, a habit of counting without speaking, and every missed candle, every thrift store card signed on the wrong line, every distracted "We'll make it up to you" went on the shelf of my mind next to practical skills like opening a stuck jar with a rubber band or fixing a flickering lamp with a careful twist, because survival in a family that drafts you as the understudy is mostly about learning to clap on cue without losing the rhythm of your own steps. When I left for college quietly, with a trunk borrowed from a neighbor and a plant cutting wrapped in wet paper towels, because someone told me dorm rooms feel less temporary if they contain something alive, I did not announce the date in the family group chat, which had been renamed 3 times to commemorate Ethan's various triumphs, and I did not text reminders or ask for a ride. And no one asked if I needed help because no one imagined I could possibly be leaving on a day they had not circled. So I lugged my things down the stairs in 2 careful trips and watched my parents laugh through the kitchen doorway at a video Ethan had sent of himself at a work orientation, and I smiled at the plant and told it we would be just fine. I was, though fine is a word that stretches like gum until it loses all flavor, and yet on the night of Ethan's 21st, which arrived with a rented bus, a themed dress code, and a champagne tower that kept listing to the left like a ship pretending to be elegant, I performed a minor miracle no one would ever confess, but everyone felt, because when the moment came for the sparkler candles to hiss and dazzle over his monogrammed cake, they sputtered, flared half-heartedly, and died in a thin ribbon of smoke that made camera flashes look like a rescue attempt, and the room let out that tiny confused sound crowds make when a magic trick breaks, and Mom's smile trembled as she fumbled for a lighter that, for reasons I may or may not understand, had no fuel, and Dad barked good-natured orders about trying again while Ethan swore under his breath about cheap party stores, and I, the reliable understudy with nimble hands and an unremarkable face, collected the failed sparklers and disposed of them with an efficiency that would have read as kindness if anyone had been watching. It was nothing, a hiccup in a night that still unfurled like a parade, but it was mine, a quiet ripple against the current, a reminder that attention is not the only kind of power, and when I walked home later with frosting on my sleeve and wind in my hair, I thought about docks and doors and the silly, stubborn way certain people assume the light will always tilt toward them, and I promised myself that when my next birthday came, and it always came whether anyone noticed or not, I would not wait in a quiet room for someone else to flip the switch, because sometimes the first act of revenge is not a spectacle at all. It is the choice to stay very calm, make a list, and start building something that can hold your weight when the rest of the house refuses to. Growing up taught me that silence can be more than absence, that it can be a tool you sharpen in the dark until it reflects back a person you recognize. So while Ethan's life kept arriving with brass bands and peel-off banners and speeches that sounded as if they had been drafted in a campaign war room, I kept moving in steady lines beneath the noise, stacking small competencies like bricks, learning to fix a leaky faucet, to negotiate a lease without shaking, to send a crisp email that turned a late fee into an apology, and to cook one reliable meal well enough that coming home never felt like defeat, and the entire time my parents kept a running commentary that treated my days as warm-up laps for the main event that was always my brother, whose triumphs were described in the family group chat with adjectives that had never once been applied to me except by strangers who had no stake in the hierarchy. When I finished college with honors, an accomplishment that might have merited at least a grocery store bouquet and a photo in the driveway, Mom forwarded a coupon for a discounted car wash and typed that she was proud in the hurried syntax of someone replying while a show cut to commercial, and Dad said he would take us out when everyone's schedules aligned, which they never did, because Ethan's new job, less a launch than a landing in a place with decent lighting, required celebratory dinners that seemed to multiply like rabbits, and I went to those dinners because participation is the tax you pay to avoid being called ungrateful, and I listened to stories about his boss, his gym, his fantasy league, while I practiced nodding with an expression that registered as supportive without giving away the fact that I was quietly building a private economy of effort no one else would ever audit. I learned to love tasks that had timelines only I could see, long projects with graphs that rose because I showed up for them, and when the urge to measure myself against the volume of Ethan's applause grew too loud, I opened my laptop and wandered real estate listings that might as well have been bedtime stories for adults who do not sleep well, favoriting properties with bad photos and good bones, learning the language of parcels and setbacks, and riparian writes the way other people memorize lyrics, and I made a folder of maps where blue water cut through green counties and little white lines showed who owned what down to the sliver, and in the corner of one screen I kept a single picture from that summer at the lake, the one where the neighbor's dock leaned out like a silver elbow, and sometimes I let myself imagine a quiet porch and a late afternoon that belonged to me. I did not say any of this aloud because their faces had a way of turning anything I loved into a curiosity to be poked until it lost its shape, so when they asked how I was, I talked about traffic and grocery prices and a coworker who collected novelty mugs, subjects that were safe and disposable, and when they asked about Ethan, I produced the highlights I had memorized from his social feeds, stitching them into a commentary so polished it might have fooled someone into thinking I admired him without reserve, and maybe I did admire him a little, the way one admires a weather system for its consistency. Though I could not help noticing that he moved through life like a man walking under a motion sensor that always turned the lights on while I felt around for the switch in the dark and learned the room by touch. There is a point at which even the patient gather proof that they have not imagined the imbalance, and mine arrived the winter my birthday drifted by like a misaddressed envelope and the family chat. which had been temporarily renamed in honor of Ethan's latest minor victory, spent the day debating which flavor of sheet cake would look best in photographs for his upcoming party. And I scrolled past the messages with the cool detachment of a museum guard until I felt something tighter and stranger and, frankly, more useful than sorrow, an urge to reshape the room rather than describe it, so I opened my calendar, created a new shared one called Family Traditions, imported every birthday and anniversary from old emails and photo timestamps, filled in gaps with careful texts to cousins who were more honest than my parents, and then, with a steadiness that surprised me, I invited everyone, not just the central trio but the entire cluster of aunts and uncles and neighbors who fancy themselves kin, checked the box that allowed guests to add photos and comments, and set my own date to public with a reminder that pinged phones at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. People like to say that revenge is loud, yet mine arrived with polite notifications and cheery automated prompts that sounded like a kindergarten teacher, and when my day came around, the calendar did what calendars do when properly fed, bursting open with posts from high school friends and book club members and a woman I once helped across an icy parking lot, filling the thread with candid snapshots and long messages about small kindnesses I did not realize had been visible, and beneath the carousel of affection there sat a quiet absence where my family's name should have been, a gap so stark that even distant relatives noticed and began tagging my parents with question marks that looked like tiny hooks. And still they said nothing for hours because silence had always served them better than explanation, until Ethan finally dropped in a one-liner about being slammed and Mom wrote that she had meant to call and Dad posted a blurry thumbs up from some patio. And the thread, now thoroughly public, turned their economy of effort inside out. By evening, I was laughing at my kitchen counter in a way that did not sound cruel, only relieved, because the day had achieved what years of hinting could not. And I closed the calendar app with the satisfying click of a lid sealing tight and opened my email to a new message that had arrived in the late afternoon like a small animal nosing at the door. A brief note from a realtor I had messaged weeks earlier about a neglected cabin on a familiar lake, the one with an old survey map attached. That showed a narrow finger of shoreline and something else that glinted like a secret, and as I pressed my thumb against the trackpad to read, I thought how sometimes the first real shift in a family does not happen at a table or in a living room. It happens in the quiet of your own kitchen when you realize you no longer need witnesses to know you are not invisible, and the subject line, short, almost shy, announced that the seller was ready to consider an offer, which is to say, the room I had mapped in the dark was about to bloom into light. The email from the realtor was a doorway I had been pressing on for months, a simple line about a seller who was finally ready to listen that felt like permission to stop treating my own life as a quiet rehearsal. So I called back with a steadiness that surprised even me and set the appointment for a weekday morning when the lake traffic would be thin and the air clean enough to hear your own footsteps on the dock, then drove out alone with coffee cooling in the cup holder and that old photograph of the neighbor's silver elbow of boards open on my phone like a talisman. And as the two-lane road narrowed into a ribcage of trees, I realized I was already telling myself a story in which the place did not merely exist, but would belong to me in the way you belong to something you have tended in your head long before a key ever touches your palm. The cabin itself was smaller than the fantasies I had allowed, a weathered rectangle tucked into a slope that carried the scent of wet pine and old rope, but its windows held the lake like a framed promise and, more important than the paint that could be stripped or the shingles that would need replacing, the survey flags marched in a tidy line from the porch down to the water where a dock, ordinary at first glance, angled just slightly more to the west than the neighboring structures. A detail I might have missed if I had not spent late nights studying parcel maps until my eyes learned to read the language of property like a second alphabet. The realtor, cheerful and only mildly curious about my solitary enthusiasm, handed me a thin folder with a title search, and tucked inside, like a pressed leaf, sat the phrase that made my mouth go dry: grandfathered riparian rights, 2 slips, exclusive use of the right-of-way across the narrow strip of land everyone called the lane. Meaning not Only the boards and pilings, but the very path to the water wore the cabin's name like a signature that could not be edited without the kind of court fight no one in the HOA wanted to pay for. I walked that path twice, once to count the steps in the deliberate rhythm of someone testing a floorboard that has betrayed her before, and once to imagine the angle of afternoon light in late August, when the lake goes the color of spilled pewter. Then sat on the edge of the dock with my feet hovering over the green water and let my mind run the reel of summers when my family rented down the shore and stared like tourists at this exact stretch of boards, which, according to the papers in my lap, had been legally promised to whoever owned the cabin long before my birth, and I understood with the clean, almost clinical clarity of a good diagnosis that the hidden bonus I had joked about in daydreams was not a secret room or a forgotten boathouse, but a piece of law that made the waterline itself bend toward me, quietly, irrevocably, like a compass settling. The negotiation was less glamorous than any real estate show would suggest. A handful of calls wedged between work meetings, a contractor's estimate used like a lever, a banker's voice reciting terms that sounded like furniture measurements. And every time my phone buzzed with a new counter, I pictured my parents arguing in a bakery over which sheet cake frosting photographs better under warm light, and I found that my heart did not race, it measured, and when the final numbers landed in a range I had calculated back in winter during the season of coupons and neglected dates, I said yes without asking anyone to bless the decision, signed my name so many times the letters went pleasantly numb, and formed an LLC with a tidy, almost bland name that gave nothing away except to me, because I understood that discretion would be the only way to enter the next room without alerting the chorus. There is a special kind of quiet that arrives after closing when the keys are heavy in your hand and no one else knows the door they open, and I spent that first afternoon walking the rooms with a notebook, cataloging everything that could be fixed with time and patience. Loose cabinet hinge, missing screen, a stubborn section of gutter, and then moved outside to where the dock waited like a dog that has learned not to jump, and I photographed every board and cleat, every angle where the planks met water, careful to capture the brass plate that gave the parcel number and the year of the rights recordation, a small square of proof that felt private and historic all at once. And I sent those images only to myself with a subject line that looked like grocery list shorthand even though it made my skin hum. I kept the renovations modest and strategic, not because I lacked appetite, but because I had learned that the most convincing transformations often begin with things other people fail to notice. The way a room deepens when you lower one shelf. The way a path feels safer when you pull the blackberry brambles back by 3-hand spans, and on weekends I sanded and painted and called in one licensed electrician who swore at the previous owner with such theatrical outrage I almost laughed, and I replaced the dock's splinter-prone outer boards with smooth lumber that would glow blonde under afternoon heat, then filled out the county's simple form for a temporary closure notice so the contractor could seal and brace the far cleat properly. A standard safety step that came with a cheerful orange tag, and I scheduled that work for the exact Saturday Ethan had been bragging about for weeks. The Lake Day photo op he had planned with rented jet skis and a content crew, an event that depended on launching at the public ramp before drifting over to the very stretch of water where my newly tagged dock would sit politely fenced with a ribbon of caution tape and a laminated sign citing the parcel number and the word authorized, bland, impersonal, irrefutable. When the morning arrived, my phone hummed with the family chat's half-panicked logistics about alternate meetups and lighting and backups and who had forgotten to pack the cooler. And Ethan's short fuse burned in a string of messages about how the town was ridiculous and someone should complain, and why on earth would maintenance happen on the busiest weekend. And I poured myself coffee on the porch while the lake winked between trees and the orange tag fluttered on my dock like a quiet flag. And I did not gloat, I simply experienced the deep, corrective pleasure of watching inevitability tilt a few degrees in my direction, a satisfaction so tidy it almost felt like mercy. Then, because revenge is best when it leaves room for an encore, I set a calendar reminder for the following month with a title that would mean nothing to anyone but me, candles, finally, and clicked save, knowing that the loud part of this story had not even started, and that when it did, the paper trail would already be perfectly in order. The decision to post was not impulsive or spiteful or the digital tantrum of a woman who wanted attention. It was a deliberate release valve on a pressure system that had been humming in the walls for years. And when I finally chose the photographs for the first carousel, I was as methodical as a stage manager calling cues, opening with a wide shot that allowed the lake to do most of the talking, its surface turning the exact color of old pewter under a late afternoon sky, then drifting inward to the restored railing, the clean curve of the repaired cleat, the brass parcel plate glinting like a polite credential, and, tucked at the very end where it would reward those who lingered, a single image of me carrying a lopsided cake down the dock. The frosting imperfect on purpose, the candles unlit but present, a visual joke about promises that would be understood by anyone who had ever smiled through a forgotten celebration and decided to host one anyway. I wrote a caption that did not mention the past yet contained it like a watermark, a few lines about learning to fix what you can and to love what you earn and to keep the door open for people who show up on time. And, because the photographs themselves told the story better than any paragraphs could, the comments began to arrive almost immediately in a chorus that felt less like applause than recognition. Neighbors from the old rental lane who remembered my polite wave. Coworkers who had watched me carry too much without complaint. Book club friends who knew how long a person can go on being fine, and the thread expanded like a porch full of chairs that someone kept bringing out from the kitchen, and I could feel, in the slow, steady way a barometer moves, the atmosphere change around me. For most of the afternoon, the family chat remained silent in that specific tactical way that announces its own strategy, and I allowed myself the luxury of pretending they were driving or resting or otherwise occupied by life's inevitable demands. But in the early evening, the dam cracked with a single message from Ethan that used the kind of brittle humor men deploy when their status has been bumped an inch to the left, something about nice flex for a quiet type, followed by the suggestion that I might want to keep private assets off public platforms unless I wanted weirdos trawling my shoreline, and before I finished absorbing the tone, which landed somewhere between brotherly advice and jurisdictional claim, Mom appeared with a paragraph that began with pride and ended with censure, the tidy sandwich of our family's discourse, insisting she wished I had told them first because the surprise had thrown her, and Dad added a thumbs up and a question about where I had found the contractor, but wrapped it in a note about safety on weekends, a phrase almost certainly cribbed from Ethan's complaint about maintenance interfering with his plans. And as I watched the three of them arrange their positions like pieces on a small board, I understood that the game they preferred involved shifting the conversation from my accomplishment to their oversight. I could have responded with a pacifying explanation and a helpful link and the kind of nuclear courtesy that keeps everyone comfortable while your stomach burns, but I had given enough tidy answers to last a decade. So I did something both smaller and more effective, which was to do nothing at all in the family chat while gently tightening my presence in the public one, replying to neighbors and friends with warmth, tagging the local bakery that had sold me the imperfect cake, inviting a musician I knew to bring a guitar next month when evenings cooled and the dock lights made the water look like solder, and I let the algorithm carry the gentle rumor of joy to people who had not heard me laugh in years. And the kindness that poured back was unspectacular and overwhelming, like rain after a long, dry season. An hour later, Mom could not stand the silence and took her concerns public under the main post, a choice that even she, who believes all problems can be resolved in kitchens, must have known would shift the ground under her feet. Writing in the tone of a woman wounded by etiquette that she had been surprised and wished the family had been invited to such a big reveal, a phrase that made my mouth tilt because it was so perfectly theatrical, and the replies arrived like a tide she had not studied in advance, gentle to a point and then sharper, friends remarking that surprises can also be joyous and that adult children are allowed to celebrate without permission, a former neighbor noting, with a diplomacy that was not really diplomacy, that I had attended every one of Ethan's boat days and that perhaps this could be one that belonged to me, and a high school friend who remembers everything asking, in a tone that felt like a hand on my back, whether Mom remembered the year I carried my own candle to the picnic table at the rental cabin, and my mother, cornered by her own performance, replied with an airy comment about memory being tricky, which earned her a scattering of polite heart reactions and a quiet retreat. Ethan, who hates losing control of a narrative even more than he dislikes cold pizza, messaged me privately with the kind of clipped sentences that betray fury hiding under the tarp of concern, accusing me of weaponizing optics, which I found so oddly amusing that I copied his message, redacted his name, and posted a story about how fascinating it is when women's joy is framed as aggression, because sometimes you do not need to name the culprit to let the pattern indict itself, and the responses to that story, which arrived from men and women and people who have been relegated to understudy roles for reasons that make less sense in daylight, braided into a rope I could lean on while I watched my brother spin in place. By the end of the night, when the lake had turned to black glass and the dock light drew a soft circle around the board ends like a blessing, I set the final piece for the next act with a simple event post that contained no pleading and no flourish. Just a date 1 month away, a time near sunset, and a line that read, "I am finally having a birthday party at the lake, open invite to those who have shown up before," which sounded softer than it was, because my definition of showing up included years of small, unfancy faithfulness that my family's calendar had never managed to track, and I closed the app, put my phone on the table, and listened to the water nudge the pilings, counting heartbeats until I felt calm enough to sleep. The comments were still crawling by when I finally picked the phone back up to set an alarm, and the last thing I saw before the screen dimmed was Ethan's newest message blinking in the family chat, something about legalities and public versus private access. And whether I had the right to rope off his side of the lane, which told me that he had finally discovered the brass plate in my photograph and was reading it the way men read anything that does not include their names, as a personal insult. And I smiled at the memory of the laminated tag and the cheerful county seal, and I let the cliff edge of morning approach with the patience of someone who knows the paperwork is on her side. The week of the party arrived with that electric pressure that makes storms feel inevitable before a single cloud gathers, and while the event post pulled in a slow braid of yes from neighbors, coworkers, and the handful of people who have always shown up without a reminder, I moved through the cabin with a purposeful calm that would have looked like indifference to anyone who misreads quiet women, stocking the fridge with small things that make gatherings comfortable, taping a paper list inside a cabinet door so volunteers could find plates and matches without asking, stringing soft lights along the porch rail where the shadows fold gently at sunset, and checking the dock one last time with the satisfaction of a person whose proof is literally bolted to the structure. Because the brass plate and the county map and the old riparian covenant were not trophies to be waved around, but tools designed to hold shape when pressure is applied by people who believe shape is negotiable. I baked a sheet cake deliberately imperfect, frosted with steady hands, but no decorative theater, an answer in sugar to the years when I learned that attention can be both currency and weapon. And I slid it into the refrigerator with the same private smile I reserve for well-kept secrets. By late afternoon, the lake relaxed into the muted silver I love most, the exact hue that makes tree lines look painted on with a wide brush, and guests began to arrive in the casual clusters of people who are not trying to impress one another, shedding tote bags and sandals, trailing laughter and stories about parking and lost sunglasses, while a friend tuned a guitar against the porch post, and the first tray of skewers hit the grill with that soft applause that makes even non-cooks feel competent. I moved through the groups with a deliberate lightness that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with claiming space, accepting hugs from people who remembered small kindnesses I had thought invisible, answering questions about the renovations with plain details and no false modesty, and, when asked about the dock, pointing with a steady hand to the plate and the line of flagged stakes that marked the right-of-way, not as provocation but as education, because the story of the dock was really the story of reading the rules closely after a lifetime of being told they were merely suggestions. They arrived the way storms finally do, all at once, and hoping their volume could rewrite the forecast. Ethan first with 2 friends whose presence gave him the illusion of a retinue, then my parents in the wake of his confidence. Faces arranged into the expression families where when they plan to call something a misunderstanding while demanding correction. And because I had learned that greeting people on a threshold is stronger than receiving them deep inside your rooms, I met them at the head of the path where the flags begin, speaking warmly enough to deny them the story of my hostility, yet clearly enough to remove ambiguity, telling Ethan that the dock and the narrow lane that fed it were private use by covenant older than any of us, that he and everyone else were welcome to the party if they could agree to behave like guests, and that photographs were fine as long as people were treated as people rather than props for a feed. He laughed in that way men do when a woman names boundaries as if she has committed a kind of rudeness, but the laughter faltered when I unfolded a tidy plastic sleeve and showed him the relevant paragraph from the recordation. The way you might show a recipe to someone insisting that cake becomes bread if you call it bread often enough, and my parents, seeing that the conversation would not tilt back to their preferred axis, tried the softer approach of asking why I had kept the purchase a secret, and I told them, without heat or apology, that I had not kept it secret, I had simply kept it mine. I could end the story by saying they turned around and left in a performance of injured dignity, yet that is not what happened, because life insists on being more complicated than revenge fantasies. And the truth is they hovered on the edge of the porch like people deciding whether to risk weather, then drifted into the crowd on the momentum of their own assumptions that rooms will make room, and for a while the equilibrium held. Because my friends are generous and the lake is a patient host. And the musician played a run of familiar songs that steadied everyone's breath, and in the small distance created by music and twilight, I found a moment to light the candles on the imperfect cake that no longer felt symbolic, just delicious. And I let the people who had shown up for years gather around me with plates and matches and loud off-key singing that would never look clean on camera but felt exactly right in air. When the song dissolved into laughter and someone pressed a knife into my hand the way you hand a pen to the person finally signing their own name, Ethan cut through the semicircle with that restless need to steer attention back into his familiar channel, launching into a speech about family, about tradition, about the hurt of being left out of milestones, the rhetorical shapeshifting of a man who wants the crowd to forget that absence is a choice, and while he spoke I could feel the dock at my back like a spine and the heat of the candles painting my hands, and I realized that I did not need to refute a single sentence, that the room had already learned how to hear, that my silence, shaped and sharpened over years, could do more work than any rebuttal. So I simply looked at him with a calm that did not invite a duel and said that doors are not closed so much as opened for the people who knock, and then I began cutting slices, passing them first to the neighbor who once carried my groceries up the rental stairs, then to the book club friend who spent a winter sending me recipes during a terrible job, and then to the musician whose second-hand guitar made the porch feel like a stage we all deserved. And only after the circle had moved twice around did I hand plates to my parents and, finally, to my brother, who took his with the expression of a man confronted by a rule he cannot charm. The night thinned into that tender hour when laughter turns to low talk and chairs tilt back on two legs, and one by one people pressed me with quick, practical affection, offers to rinse pans, to coil extension cords, to text photos, until the porch quieted and the lake went black except for the rope of dock lights making a walkway to nowhere, and my parents hovered again at the threshold of goodbye, saying the gentle, belated things families say when they want to rearrange the narrative without admitting to the first draft, and I listened, not cruelly, not indulgently, and I told them that the calendar would send reminders next year because I had said it that way, and that they were welcome if they wished to come, and when Ethan asked, in a smaller voice than I expected, whether he could borrow the dock next weekend for an early filming hour if he promised to keep things quiet and to respect the neighbors, I said that I would think about it if he sent the plan in writing and included a note acknowledging the covenant, and I watched him wrestle with the notion that acknowledgement might be the price of access, which is to say, that respect is a key. Much later, after the taillights stitched themselves into the trees and the porch wore that abandoned look houses get when the last glass is turned over, I walked to the end of the dock alone and sat on the warm boards with my feet above the ink of the water. the brass plate cool under my palm like the edge of a coin, and I thought about how the story I had been telling myself for so long, girl overlooked, woman forgotten, sister tolerated, had quietly molted into a different shape without a trumpet or a victory pose, just a series of decisions that looked small until they changed the landscape, and I considered the next line I might write, whether forgiveness would be a chapter or a footnote, whether the party had been a beginning or a border. And as the night wind moved across the lake like breath, the dock shifted in its patient way, and I laughed softly at the unresolvable questions, because it felt honest to leave them unanswered for now, to stand up, to pinch out the last candle with damp fingers, and to walk back toward a house that belonged to me even when no one was looking, the path lit not by applause, but by the practical glow of motion-sensing lights that finally turned on when they sensed the right person coming home.